Dr. Sahar Khamis, everyone. She is an expert on Arab and Muslim media, an associate professor at the Department of Communication at the University of Maryland, and the former head of the Mass Communication Department at Qatar University. She is the co-author of a number of books, including Islam.com, Contemporary Islamic Discourses in Cyberspace, Egyptian Revolution 2.0, Political Blogging, Civic Engagement, and Citizen Journalism, as well as Arab Women's Activism and Socio-Political Transformation, Unfinished Gendered Revolutions, and a recipient of number of prestigious academic and professional awards. Dr. Sahar Khamis, welcome.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. First of all, I want to comment on the point about diversity, that sometimes people want to paint another group with just one broad brush, right? So, all Muslims are this, or Muslim women are that, and I'm like, which Muslims are you talking about, right? The Muslims in Indonesia are quite different from the Muslims in my home country, Egypt, quite different from Lebanon, which is another Arab country, quite different from Morocco, and definitely quite different from Muslims in Pakistan or Bangladesh, right? And they're all Muslims at the end of the day, but they have so many differences in terms of their culture, their everyday practices, and so on and so forth. The same thing, in my opinion, applies to other racial, ethnic, and also faith groups. When you talk about Jews, right? When you talk about Christians, you talk about Western people. Again, you cannot just use these terms like that broadly. You have to be specific, and you have to understand the differences and the nuances of these terms. And you don't just put people in one basket and just paint them with one broad brush. I think that for American Muslims, there's a lot of issues here in terms of also lack of understanding. People do not quite understand this group of people, that we do have our own cultural background, which is different. You have the African American Muslims, you have the Asian American Muslims, you have the Arab American Muslims, and all of them have similarities, but they also have differences as well. And I think the whole idea of reaching out to the other is a two-way street. I always look at it as a two-way street, not a one-way street, meaning others have to try to take a step in my direction to try to understand me and understand who I am. I also have a responsibility to try to reach out to them and also introduce myself and get to know them as well. This is very, very important. And going back to your great question about whether the internet, bridges the differences or whether it widens some of these differences, again, I think it can do both. We did find in my book, Islam.com, that we really have these two extremes. Sometimes people have what we call unanimous consensus, which is really emotional rather than rational. In other words, oh, you like me, we are best friends, we are buddies, let's all agree on every issue, let's just like each other's posts and life is good. We did not really engage in any kind of dialogue. You did not understand me. I did not try to understand you, but who cares? We're good friends. Let's just, give all of these likes and shares and posts and reposts and retweets. And we don't do any kind of intellectual exercise to really try to understand issues at a much deeper level, or even understand each other at a much deeper level. And that means that, you have unity, but it's not really a unity based on understanding as much as it's a unity based on emotional consensus. And we also found the other extreme of total, antagonism and hatred and polarization and fragmentation and division, which again is not based on dialogue or being informative or trying to inform others, as much as it's just like, oh my God, I hate these people, I hate their guts. I'm going to get online and I'm going to just try to make sure to tarnish their image or to use my social media weapons as my tools against them, again, without any kind of rationality or any kind of reasoning. So I think the world needs a lot of intellectual maturity. We all need to collectively grow up and become more mature adults in terms of our, social media behavior, that these tools, which are at our fingertips, can be very constructive, but they can also be very destructive.
And these are Muslims talking to Muslims, right? That you're speaking of, that are so destructive in their commentary.
Well, we studied both groups. We studied Muslims and other Muslims, and we studied Muslims and non-Muslims.
Right. And
we did find that, even within the Muslim community itself, like sometimes between certain groups coming from different background or different sects of Islam, like Sunnis and Shiites, you can still find some of these, polarizations I was talking about, and the two extremes of either emotional consensus on some issues, but also polarization and division on other issues. So that was really a comment or a finding that can be applicable to both dialogues between Muslims and other Muslims, and Muslims and non-Muslims.
And I know you said that both exist, but which one did you find is more apparent or at least more abundant? Was it the negative or the positive?
Well, I consider both of them, as I said before, to be negative, because even when you have this emotional consensus, like you agree with me on everything, we're very good friends. You just keep saying, yeah, sure, I agree with you, Dr. Sahar. This is great. This is amazing. This is excellent. Well, that's, thank you. But did we really learn anything from this conversation? Did it make us, did it make us smarter, more intelligent? Not necessarily so, right? So we really, myself and my co-author came up with the conclusion that both of these extremes, the extreme of emotional consensus as well as the extreme of deep polarization, division, and fragmentation, they're both unhealthy. They're not really necessarily constructive or useful. What was really missing is this middle ground I talked about before, the middle ground of understanding, reasoning, wisdom, constructive dialogue, and trying to come to a middle ground of real understanding based on understanding ourselves and others at a deeper level, and being able to come up with something which is much more meaningful and constructive. And that was pretty much absent, whether in dialogues between Muslims and other Muslims or between Muslims and non-Muslims, unfortunately. And that's what we need to invest a lot of time and effort to try to work on.
Yeah, because even when I'm on my secular Twitter, or even when I see Muslim posts, Islamic posts, I find what you say to be very true. The extremes are the ones that are commenting. And I asked myself the same question, but I also thought in a manner for a second that all Muslims are starting to become, or most Muslims are starting to become on either extremity, extremely, very much so liberal, or extremely conservative and closed-minded and judgmental towards others. And I was like, whoa, like, are these all Muslims that are becoming like this? And I spoke to my dad about it, and my dad was like, okay, well, look at how many people viewed this post on Instagram. I was like, there's like 1,500,000. He's like, okay, how many posts, how many comments are there? I was like, around 1,700. He said, okay, those are the deviants. There's about 1,500,000 Muslims who have viewed this post that are relatively probably towards the middle ground that haven't commented. Do you think that also has to do with just people that are more in the middle, just don't care to comment, don't want to put themselves in that situation and get in a headache with these people?
Correct. It's very true. Like a silent majority, right? Sometimes you can get a silent majority, those who are not willing to engage in these types of, hate matches or boxing matches or shouting matches online. So they decide not to comment. Your father's comment is absolutely true and very realistic, that you have the majority of people in most cultures, traditions, religions, you name it, are moderate people, right? And then you have the extremes. The extremes, whether too liberal or too conservative, but the majority are in the middle. But the majority in the middle, oftentimes their voices are absent. And that's a problem, because then you get this kind of skewed image, as if, people who are on the internet, oh my God, look at this. This is terrible. You have all of these people who are spouting hatred at me because, I'm wearing the hijab, because I'm wearing the headscarf. It's terrible, But maybe because these are the people who came in this kind of discussion or conversation already with some kind of stereotypes or misperceptions or misconceptions, and then started to reflect all of that in their own comments in cyberspace. But then the majority, who may be perfectly fine with me being, an educated academic Muslim woman, Muslim American woman wearing a hijab, wearing a headscarf, they're perfectly fine with that, who represent the majority of my neighbors and colleagues and co-workers and people I meet on the street. Maybe they don't enter this kind of discussion, or they don't comment on these types of posts in the first place. So I totally second the idea of the silent majority. But I think this silent majority also has a role to play, like I said before, which is trying to bring some sense into some of the senseless things that happen in cyberspace.
I know, and it's hard sometimes, because when you're usually a moderate person, you're most likely level-headed. And so it's very irritating when you comment something and all these extremities are now attacking you, because now you're not only an enemy of conservatives or liberals, now you're an enemy of both, and they both hate you more than they hate each other, probably. So it's just, That's what makes it very difficult for moderate people, whether Muslim or non-Muslim, to comment on these kind of discourses, because it's just like, oh my God, I know that's what makes me definitely not comment.
Yeah, you're not alone. I think you're representing a lot of people when you make these types of comments you're making now. You speak for a lot of people, honestly, who are the silent majority in cyberspace. And I think that, there is a need for what we call media literacy, right? Media literacy is a very important term, which means basically, okay, we are consuming this kind of influx of social media, and sometimes we have an information overload. We are on our devices way too much, right? We're on our computers and our cell phones and iPads and tablets way too much, many, many hours a day. Okay. But are we doing the right things? Are we using our time correctly, wisely, intelligently? Are we necessarily using it constructively to inform ourselves and others and engage in that? Or is it just a waste of time? Or is it just, engaging in some kind of, as I said before, a bubble or an echo chamber? Or is it becoming a shouting match and some kind of boxing match? Or is it just entertainment? Or is it just escaping from our work and duties? Sometimes you just kill time on the internet, like, oh, oops, I have not really worked today. I just wasted 5 hours on, Instagram or social media. So media literacy helps people, ordinary people, average people, to understand how does this whole thing about the internet and cyberspace work? How can we make the best out of it, right? How can we possibly use it constructively, wisely, and effectively, maximize the benefit and minimize the harm? That's what media literacy means. When you talk about things like misinformation and disinformation, when you mention misinformation, disinformation about Islam and Muslims, right? How can I possibly navigate the internet wisely? And how can I tell the difference between an authentic website, which is truly giving me correct information and the right knowledge about Islam and Muslims, and some of the fake accounts or the cloaked Facebook pages or accounts I was talking about earlier? All of that needs us to sharpen our media literacy skills and tools. And I'm afraid that there isn't enough that's being done in this regard. I would think that from now on, we need to have a course or a subject area about media literacy. I see now kids as young as 2 and 3 year old, honestly, holding their own tablet. Like in the airport, the parents are talking to them. They don't even listen to their parents because they're so busy with their own tablets. And they're like only 2 years old or 2 or 3 years old. And I'm like, oh my God, that means we really, really have to pay attention and maybe start teaching media literacy from now on, not at the university level or the postgraduate level, but maybe even starting from, elementary school and upward.
But what is, like, you mentioned how media literacy would help us, but what is media literacy necessarily?
Yeah, that's a great question. Media literacy is actually the ability to be able to sharpen your own tools and skills when you are a media user. So when you are a media user, someone who is spending all of these many, many hours every single day on social media, on digital media, on all forms of media, you don't necessarily have the tools to understand how does the media work, right? Something like the algorithms we talked about before, the built-in biases that are structured or are existing inside the structure or the actual setup of cyberspace itself. How does it work? Things like, how can I use the internet safely without putting myself in danger? Invasion of privacy, threat to my personal security. How much information should I share about myself? How can I authenticate the information I receive online? How can I make sure it is really facts, not fiction? How can I make sure it is actual information, not disinformation or misinformation, right? All of that is what we call media literacy. And I'm afraid there isn't enough that's being done to teach us these skills.
Yeah, and it's a scary subject because I do a little bit of research on Muslim discourse within Facebook pages, because I've been starting to join a couple Muslim Facebook pages just to see how people talk myself. And I even look at comments under YouTube channels and all that kind of stuff. And what you're saying is very true, as well as the fact that people ask questions about Islam, whether Muslim or non-Muslims. And they ask questions like, I saw this question the other day where a guy was like, is lobster haram? Is lobster not permissible in Islam? And the majority of the answers was, yes, it is haram. And I was like, oh my God, they're getting misinformation. These people are spreading false information about Islam. And so that's a scary subject, right? Like has the internet allowed Muslims to accept information from non-educated, non-authentic sources rather than getting it from what Muslims usually used to get it from, scholars?
Mm-hmm. This is an excellent question. In my first book, Islam.com, that we just were talking about a moment ago, we actually noticed this whole phenomenon that basically it's not about the traditional authoritative religious figures or scholars anymore. Many people enter the field of fatwa, and fatwa means giving religious advice or giving religious opinion or judgment without necessarily being skilled or equipped to play this particular role, right? So it can be somebody who is I don't know, an artist, or maybe who is an engineer or a nurse or whatever profession, and then they pose online as if they are quote unquote religious scholars, when in fact they don't have the right religious training or background or expertise to be able to give the religious advice or the religious opinion or judgment, which is required in this particular case. So there is definitely also a role for traditional clergy, for Muslim, clergy, religious figures, to be able to really kind of step in. And we noticed at that time, of course, the book was written in 2009. So we're talking about a good now 12 years ago. 12 years ago, of course, the situation is different from now. I'm sure if we try to revisit some of these issues now, we will find some of the younger, maybe clergy, who are educated, and at the same time, they have cultural and linguistic skills that enable them to enter this field of cyberspace and to actually correct some of these misperceptions and some of this misinformation and disinformation. Because at that time, we noticed that some of the clergy were like, oh, I want to talk about this, but nobody invited me into the conversation, or I don't have the necessarily important or useful linguistic tools. I don't master foreign languages, or I don't have the digital skills or digital literacy tools. So I think that one idea which is really tempting now is to try to revisit all of that, right? How much has that changed in cyberspace between 2009 and now? Maybe we're going to find, hopefully, we have a new generation of clergy and those who are religious scholars who have both the cultural competency, the linguistic competency, and at the same time the religious knowledge and information which is needed. Because I think this is what's most needed now, especially to reach the Western Muslims and American Muslims and young people in the West and young people in America. They need to be on cyberspace, but they also need to have the proper and the good role models, and to have the religious clergy and religious authority, people who are actually able to talk to them in their own language. And when I say language, I mean the actual language, as well as language meaning in a figurative sense, that they're able to be with them on the same page, to understand where they're coming from, to understand what's going on in their minds, right? And that's very important, because if you don't have that, then you have a big vacuum. Who's going to fill this vacuum? People who are not necessarily qualified, not necessarily able to play this role correctly, people who are not necessarily equipped with the right tools and preparation and experience to be able to play this particular role. So that's a very important thing as well.